Before we get into the question of whether truly unbiased media exists, consider how radically information has changed over the last century. Every generation inherited a different media environment. What began with newspapers and radio eventually moved to television, then the internet, social media, algorithmic feeds, and now artificial intelligence. And with every transition, the way people understand reality changed too. The greatest generation. Media was something you consumed. The greatest generation, generally born between 1901 and 1927, grew up during the Great Depression and later lived through World War II. Their media world was almost entirely one way. Newspapers were dense, detailed, and often filled with long blocks of text. Radio was becoming a major source of entertainment and information, but audiences didn't have much control over what they heard. Families would gather around a radio in the living room and listen together. Information moved slowly. Newspapers, publishers, and wartime authorities controlled what reached the public, and ordinary people weren't expected to create media themselves. There were enormous technical and financial barriers between the average citizen and mass communication. You didn't publish your own news. You read the newspaper. You didn't broadcast your own show. You listened to the radio. Media was something to trust, respect, and consume. The silent generation, from radio to television. The silent generation, born between 1928 and 1945, occupied a unique position in media history. Their childhood was dominated by radio, but their world eventually transformed with the arrival of television. When television networks became established in the late 1940s and early 1950s, the number of channels was extremely limited. There weren't hundreds of options. There wasn't an endless feed. There were only a few national channels, often broadcasting for limited hours. Television therefore became something of a family ritual. People gathered around the set and watched together, much like earlier generations had gathered around the radio. They didn't constantly switch between programs or multitask while watching. Media was still scarce, and because it was scarce, it carried enormous attention. The 1950s also brought major technological changes, including the development of color television standards. Television was becoming more powerful, but the real transformation was still ahead. Baby boomers. They trusted the TV anchor. Baby boomers born between 1946 and 1964 were the first generation to grow up with television as a completely normal part of everyday life. National nightly news broadcasts became a central source of information. Major events, political debates, wars, and historic moments were suddenly entering people's living rooms through television. For many boomers, television didn't simply provide information. It helped define what information could be trusted. News anchors became recognizable authority figures. If something appeared on the evening news, many viewers accepted it as an objective account of reality. The presidential debates of 1960 demonstrated just how powerful television could be. The appearance of the candidates became almost as important as their words. And then came live television coverage of historic moments, such as the moon landing. Millions of people could watch history happen almost simultaneously. The media landscape was still highly centralized, dominated by only a handful of major networks. That created something younger generations would eventually lose, a shared national information experience. Millions of people were watching the same stories from the same broadcasters at roughly the same time. Generation X. Cable news changes everything. Then came Generation X. Born into a rapidly changing media environment, Gen X witnessed the explosion of cable television during the 1980s. The old television monopoly began to break apart. Suddenly, there were specialized channels, more programming, and eventually 24-hour news. CNN helped create the idea of a news cycle that never stopped. MTV introduced another fast, highly visual style of media. Information was becoming louder, faster, and more competitive. Networks weren't simply trying to inform viewers anymore. They were competing for attention. Sensational headlines, emotional stories, flashy graphics, and dramatic presentation became increasingly important. And this constant stream of information helped produce a defining characteristic of Gen X: skepticism. They learned to look beyond polished television presentations and question the commercial motives behind them. But their biggest contribution came later. As young adults, Gen X became one of the first generations to explore the early internet. They were the bridge between two completely different worlds. They remembered life before the internet, yet they also learned how to navigate the emerging digital world. Instead of information being pushed downward from a few powerful institutions, people could begin searching for information themselves. The relationship between audiences and media was changing. Millennials. They democratized media. Then came the Millennials. They inherited the internet infrastructure explored by Gen X and used it to break down the traditional barriers surrounding media. They didn't want to simply watch, they wanted to participate. The rise of Web 2.0 brought blogging, social networking, MySpace, Facebook, and other platforms that transformed people from passive audiences into active participants. Information was no longer traveling in only one direction. It became a conversation. And then, in 2005, YouTube changed video forever. Before YouTube, reaching a global audience with video usually required television infrastructure, a broadcasting license, or a Hollywood studio. YouTube removed many of those barriers. Anyone with an internet connection and a basic camera could potentially publish to the world. A teenager sitting in a bedroom could suddenly reach an audience larger than some traditional television programs. Traditional media companies were forced to adapt. The old boundaries between television, newspapers, entertainment, and journalism began collapsing into one digital environment. And for better or worse, the audience became part of the media machine. Influencers replace institutions. During the 2010s, another major transformation happened. Trust in traditional institutions weakened among younger audiences. In their place came influencers. People increasingly followed individuals they felt personally connected to. The relationship was no longer simply between a viewer and a television network. It was between a viewer and a personality. News, lifestyle advice, entertainment, political opinions, product recommendations, all of it could come directly from online creators. The creator economy grew rapidly, and major brands began working with influencers on platforms such as Instagram and TikTok. But there was a major trade-off. The same system that gave creators freedom also created new ways to exploit attention. Authenticity became extremely valuable. Creators had to appear genuine while simultaneously operating inside an increasingly commercial environment, and the line between personal connection and marketing became harder to see. Generation Z. They became the media. Then came Generation Z. For them, the internet wasn't something they had to learn later in life. It was already there. They grew up with smartphones in their hands and social media built into everyday communication. Short-form platforms such as TikTok transformed how information was created and consumed. For Gen Z, making media isn't simply a hobby. It's a primary form of communication. They don't necessarily wait for journalists to arrive at an event. They record what is happening themselves. They post it. They live stream it. They explain it. They become the source. That completely changes journalism. But this new power comes with a serious problem. The algorithms controlling these platforms are designed to maximize engagement, and that can place people inside highly personalized information bubbles. Two people sitting next to each other can open their phones and see completely different versions of reality. The older generation experienced a shared media environment. Gen Z experiences a fragmented one, and the more engaging the content becomes, the harder it can be to look away. Generation Alpha, growing up with AI. Now we arrive at Generation Alpha, and their media environment may be the most unusual of all. Artificial intelligence is becoming part of their everyday lives. For this generation, media isn't necessarily something created only by humans. Algorithms can generate it. AI can modify it. Synthetic voices can reproduce speech. AI systems can interact with users. And predictive text and voice tools are becoming normal parts of education and communication. The boundary between authentic and artificial content is becoming increasingly difficult to identify. For Generation Alpha, information won't simply be something they read in a newspaper, watch on television, or search for online. It can become interactive. It can respond to them. It can adapt to their preferences in real time. The challenge for this generation won't simply be learning how to access information. It will be learning how to determine what deserves to be believed. The first generation that controls the narrative. And that brings us to the biggest transformation of all. For centuries, a relatively small number of institutions controlled mass communication. Editors decided what appeared in newspapers. Networks decided what appeared on television. Broadcasters decided what millions of people heard. Today, that system has largely collapsed. Young creators can choose their own feeds. They can produce their own videos. They can build audiences without traditional media companies. And they can potentially turn a story into a global phenomenon overnight. The boundaries between print, television, social media, and online video have almost disappeared. Everything is becoming one enormous digital stream. That gives ordinary people an unprecedented level of creative freedom, but it also creates an enormous challenge. If everyone has the ability to influence the narrative, then the idea of a shared objective truth can become increasingly fragile. The history of media shows us something important. Whoever controls the feed doesn't just influence what people think, they can influence what people believe reality actually is.